friends and welcome back to my channel. My name is Katey Flowers and today we are doing a bit of a fun tarot tag. This is called the 7 Decks for Heavenly Virtues and it was started by Antonia's Bliss. This is based on another tag which was started by Sylvain's Deadly Sins, which was the 7 Decks for Deadly Sins tag. So many tags! I did not do that tag, but I did have a lot of fun watching the videos. But this one popped up in my feed recently and I was in the mood for a tag, so here we are. I will leave a link to both Antonia's original video and Sylvain's original video, as well as the prompts to this tag in the description box below, so if you would like to do a video response to this tag, you can. Anyway, this is just a fun tag where we pair up the 7 Heavenly Virtues with a particular tarot deck in our collection. And I am going to use most of Antonia's prompts as provided, but there's one that I've changed a little bit just to make more sense for me and how I see it. But I'll explain a little bit more when we get there. For now, let's just dive right in. The first heavenly virtue is Prudence. And the prompt for this is to pick a practical or all-purpose kind of deck. And for this one, I actually decided to go with a deck that I have actually only started working with fairly recently, and it's the This Might Hurt Tarot by Isabella Rotman. I recently did a full tarot and practice episode with this deck, and in that I just really enjoy the experience of working with it. It's a largely Rider-Waite-Smith based deck. Most of these cards will be fairly familiar to anyone familiar with the Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck. But instead of looking all European, old-timey, this deck is very solidly contemporary. The setting is very clearly our modern world, and the people depicted throughout the cards are a diversity of different identities and experiences. In my tarot and practice episode, I said that I think that this is a great updated version of the Rider-Waite-Smith, especially for those of us who do love the Rider-Waite-Smith and its symbolism, but yearn for a more representative deck, one that we can better identify with and maybe our clients can better identify with as well. And I think for a prompt like this, a few years ago, I would have just gone with the Rider-Waite-Smith because it's such like an old faithful, it's sort of the standard, it's just easy to pull out, it's easy to read with because of my familiarity with it. And even though I do still love the Rider-Waite-Smith, I always will, this deck, I really meant it when I said that this had kind of replaced that for me in so many ways. When I read with this, I have the same feeling I have when I go to the Rider-Waite-Smith of just being able to throw down the cards and just being able to read. Like in that tarot and practice, I didn't spend a lot of time, explicitly talking about the symbolism. I just read. In some ways, it's been simplified from the Rider-Waite-Smith. It doesn't feel like the symbolism is like overly esoteric. And in that way, I think it walks an incredible line between being traditional and familiar and being modern and simple and clear. It's something that I really appreciate about this deck and I think makes it one that's just so easy to go to, an all-purpose kind of deck that's easy to just throw down cards and get a clear message from. And as far as reading for other people as well, of course, I will always advocate for more and more representative and diverse decks, but this one feels at least like it's going to give a nod to the experience of most people that I would read for without depicting anything that might be overly specific or triggering to some people, like some of the other decks that I've picked for later prompts might be. It feels like a pretty safe pick, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say when reading for other people. And that's just another way in which this deck feels like a great all-rounder to me. Now for Justice. This is a deck we go to help us make decisions. And of course, this can be true for any of these prompts. I can use almost all of my decks for any of these prompts. And indeed, I use a variety of different decks for different kinds of decisions that I have to make. But the most recent deck that I used for helping me make a decision was the Orion's Tarot. So I think it made sense to pick this one for this prompt today. This is just such a beautiful deck and the only animal tarot deck that I have in my collection. And I think the only deck that I have 2 copies of. I have this, which is like the standard one with the red gilding, and then I also have the pocket edition as well. I know, quite unlike me in so many ways. The art on this is just absolutely captivating. There's no way else to say it. And even though I've said time and time again that I don't tend to like animal decks, which has been a fairly consistent truth here on my channel, this one I think is an exception to the rule. And in fact, I think it being an animal deck is actually one of the reasons why I decided to go to it for a decision recently. I think having animals depicted instead of people just sort of, gave a level of detachment or removal for me. Instead of immediately seeing myself in the cards, with people that I maybe identify with or in positions that maybe I identify with or whatever, instead of projecting myself into the image or seeing maybe people around me in the images, having animals in these cards just sort of allowed me to sit with the message itself. And the numerology actually came into play with this deck and my readings of it than it generally does in my readings. Like as in literally the numbers 1, 2, whatever it was like a big part of the answers. For example, if I had 2 options and I asked it which would be better, it would often come up with like an ace, for example, to say option 1. On top of that, for some decks, especially when I'm reading for myself, I do really enjoy reading the guidebooks. And that's especially true for more difficult decisions that I'm having to make. And the Orion's Tarot is one of those guidebooks that I just really, really enjoy. It's one of those ones that's beautiful to read through, really specific and detailed, but also I find that when I'm going to it with a specific question in mind and I'm reading a particular card that's come up, the answers are just very synchronistic as well. The Sakurai Beto is another one for me where the guidebook just really, really aids the deck, especially when I'm asking tricky questions. And I often find that like a sentence or something will just pop out as something like literally that answers my question. Or maybe like literally something that someone had said to me or that I had said myself that I hadn't paid attention to before, that sort of stuff. So the guidebook is as much a reason as the deck itself as to why I pick a deck a lot of the time for like decision making, especially big decisions. And that is one of the many ways in which the Orion's Tarot excels. Third heavenly virtue is Fortitude. And here we're picking a deck that doesn't pull any punches. And I actually feel like I have quite a few decks like this in my collection. I think it's a kind of deck that I am quite drawn to. Some examples over the years have been my Stella's Tarot, the Fantastic Menagerie Tarot, but another example that's a little bit more recent for me is the Children of Litha Tarot. Now, the thing that all of these decks have in common is the fact that I do feel like they just are very straight, sharp shooters, but they all also sort of do that with a bit of a sense of humor. The Fantastic Menagerie is a very dark kind of humor. The Stella's Tarot feels a little bit sassy, a little bit snarky, whereas the Children of Litha feels like that fey trickster kind of energy, almost like it's laughing at me, which I love. I love that experience. And this is another one that I've done a full tarot and practice episode with, so I'll leave a link to that in the cards and the description box below for you if you'd like to watch. This is another deck that I think is a little bit unusual for me. It does feature humanoid characters both in the major arcana and in the court cards. However, the majority of the minor arcana are animals. So although it's not a solely animal deck, there are an awful lot of animals in here for someone who doesn't tend to like animal tarot decks. But this one just totally works for me. And I think you can see in the tarot and practice episode, some of the readings that I did, I just got very, very direct, clear answers. But also this deck created some space for me to kind of like laugh at myself, to not take situations that were causing me pain or anguish quite as seriously as I'm sometimes inclined to do, and to certainly not take myself so damn seriously all the time. And I think the reason that humor works so well in tandem with straight shooting decks is because it sort of disarms us and allows us space to hear messages that are maybe a little bit more confronting, a little bit trickier. Rather than just a punch to the gut, that humor, that levity creates a bit of an open door, if you like, into having a bit more self-reflection and a bit of a trickier conversation. And even though some of the messages have been a little bit more serious or severe with this deck, I do find that when something's especially sticky for me, this deck brings through a biting sense of humor that really works to get me out of my own head and get me out of my own way. I love this deck. It's one that I haven't had for quite as long as some of my others, but it's quickly become a favorite. And I especially love how it uses humor to sort of like push through an answer that maybe I didn't really want to hear, or just helps me see something with a little bit of a different perspective and to get unstuck a lot of the time. Now for Temperance. Now this is the one that I actually decided to change from the original prompt. Antonia's prompt was a deck pairing that you really love, and I totally get this prompt and where it's coming from. I think especially with our idea of the Temperance card in tarot being often about two different elements coming together to create something new, that alchemy. But for me, Temperance, and especially the virtue of Temperance, has a lot more to do with restraint, moderation, and clarity. And as someone who struggled with addiction issues in the past, that is something that's just really near and dear to my heart. So instead, I decided to go more with that theme and that framing of the word temperance and the virtue. And as such, I picked the Spacious Tarot. This is a beautiful deck. It's one that I've spoken a lot about on my channel. I think I did an unboxing. I think I did a review. I've done a full tarot and practice episode. It's been featured in so many of my favorites videos. And I think the reason it works so well for me and my idea of temperance is just like the decisions in terms of the creation and the representations of the cards. Plenty of decks and creators have tried to sort of distill each card into a really simple, almost minimalistic image, to remove all of that esoteric symbolism, all of like the complexities of the cards, and just represent the core message of the card. And many of them have done it very well, but for me, the Spacious Tarot has done it the best. This imagery is not minimalistic aesthetically, that's not what I mean, but in terms of the actual representations of the message. I think that in many ways it is. And I think achieving that in and of itself required a huge amount of both knowledge, but also restraint from the creators. The restraint not to include anything ephemeral or unnecessary at all. Like there's just enough here. There's always just enough to be clear and specific about the message without overcomplicating it or pigeonholing the message too much. And I've said before how I love the name, the Spacious Tarot, because I think it's perfect for this deck. That minimalism, that restraint has allowed so much space for us as the reader to step into the cards, to sort of see ourselves in the cards, to position ourselves into the cards, but also to make room for our own understandings and our own messages to come forth. And the feeling that this deck gives me, actually, it took me a little while to identify, but as soon as it clicked, it was like a light bulb moment. And that was a moment about 9 years ago, not long after I'd just gotten sober. I'd just come out of hospital for the first time, and Blair and I and a few friends went to a bush stuff. We went camping. And of course, in a situation like that, most people were using some kind of substances. I, however, was entirely sober and fairly newly sober. But I have such a vivid memory and recall of one particular moment of sitting on the side of the hill as the sun was setting. And I quietly cried looking around at how beautiful everything and everyone was. And realizing, I think for the first time, that just being, just existing, just being here and now is the most beautiful, glorious thing there is. That I didn't have to be fucked up to be having fun. I didn't have to be fucked up for things to be beautiful or exciting. I didn't even have to be fucked up to be happy. I still recognize that moment as just a big shift for me internally of what life could look like, of what life could be without substances and without other really unhealthy coping strategies. That moment, that feeling is what this deck reminds me of. It's simple, it's restrained, but it's expansive. It's at once the most simple thing in the world and one of the hardest. And that is why this deck absolutely fits the prompt for Temperance for me. Our sixth heavenly virtue is faith. And our prompt for this one is a deck that we go to for spiritual guidance. Now, I am a very, very agnostic person. So faith is not something that I tend to think about too much. I know faith can come in many different forms, but I suppose it's just not an idea I contemplate too often. But when I am struggling with really, really big existential questions and no other deck is kind of quite hitting the spot for me, I go to my one, my only, my Guild Tarot. I know some of you were a bit worried that I was like not really into the Guild Tarot anymore. I can tell you I absolutely am. It's just not a deck I go to very often because I don't feel like I have those big questions that I just kind of, like keep me up at night. I don't have those too often. And most of the time I'm better suited going to other decks. But every now and then there's just something that's just like weighing on my soul that I just can't quite get my head around, can't quite get my heart around. And I just need something, I don't know, a little bit bigger. And for me, that's what this Guild Tarot is. I know this is a divisive deck. People either love or hate it. I am very, very firmly in the camp of absolutely adoring this one. And sometimes I'm not even sure I know why. Like with so many of these other decks, I can point to the incredible representation, like identifying with particular decks or them really just moving me in ways that feel very specific to that deck, or the artwork just being incredibly beautiful to look at. I don't necessarily know what it is about this deck. I can't really pinpoint it for you. All I know is that something in me was moved the very first time I saw these images online. Even for someone who is very agnostic, my experience of this deck feels mystical. It feels magical. And although I don't use this deck very often, when I have sort of felt like nothing else is quite hitting the spot, this deck comes through for me every single time. This deck helps me feel connected to something bigger than myself. I don't know what that something is. I'm not sure that I always believe in it. I know that I certainly don't have words to talk about it very well, but sometimes I need to tap into that. And when I do, this deck is always here for me. Most of the time, I'm more concerned with living in alignment with my values, connecting with the people that I love, doing things that I'm passionate about. But sometimes those bigger questions, those bigger quandaries do weigh on me. And I do need to tap into that something bigger that I don't quite have words for. And that is when this deck shows up for me. And it has never failed me. And I don't think it ever will. Our next virtue is hope. And this is a deck for dark times. And I absolutely had to pick the Next World Tarot. Another one that I've done a Tarot and Practice episode with, and I very, very often describe this deck as intrinsically hopeful. This is absolutely one of my favorite decks. I love the artwork and I just love how well this deck depicts and represents the diversity of human experience, how I see myself in these cards, how I see my different identities and experiences in these cards. And importantly, I also see the variety of experiences of my communities in these cards. That's all stuff that really matters to me. But also in the cards themselves, seeing people in the margins make space for themselves, be proud of themselves, stand up for themselves, stand up for what's right, to love and be loved, to celebrate, to cry, to grieve, to create. In the face of a world that often doesn't want us, that often seeks to destroy so many of us, it's all just so real, so honest, and utterly, utterly hopeful. I love this deck. This is a deck that will never ever not be in my collection. So even though I've spoken at length about it already on this channel, expect to continue hearing me speak about it because I love it that much. And a big part of why I love it so much is how it reminds me to be hopeful, but that hope is something that we create, that we continue working for. It's not just something that exists independently of us and our actions. And then finally, charity, a deck you would gift. And for this, I don't have one deck, but I have a type of deck, a publisher. I'm not sure, but it is definitely a rock pool deck. And I have actually given many copies of all three of these decks. These are the Australian Wildflower reading cards, the Saltwater reading cards, and the Dreamtime reading cards. I love all of these decks for many reasons, partly because of just how vibrant and beautiful the artwork in all of them is. The guidebooks also offer plenty of information without offering too much. On top of that, they're Australian and they celebrate Australian, including Aboriginal artists and creators. They're mass market and they're very affordable, especially for the quality that you get with these decks. And then on top of that, given that they're oracle decks and they're not overtly religious or spiritual, I think they're very accessible, and they're decks that I know a lot of people who aren't really into divination, aren't really into tarot, have really enjoyed when I've gifted them. As I said, I actually have given these decks to people before as gifts, as well as Cheryl and Darcy's other deck, the one that comes in the yellow box. I think it's just the Wildflowers as opposed to the Australian Wildflowers. They just make really great gifts that are beautiful, that people enjoy using, that aren't too intimidating. You don't need to learn or know a whole lot. You know, just drawing a card, there's plenty to go off there, and then the guidebooks give you enough without giving you too much. These are decks that I've given to my cousins, to my mum, to my friends. So those are my answers to Antonia Bliss's 7 decks for Heavenly Virtues. Thank you so much for starting this tag. As I mentioned, their original video will be in the description box below. Of course, I have to say a big thank you to my lovely patrons over on Patreon for all of the support that they've shown me and my channel over the years. And especially big thank you goes to my high tier Patreons, Livia, Lynette Brown, Laurie, and Ian Yitzhak. Thank you so much. But that's all from me for now, so thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you in the comments and in the next video. Until then, so much love. Bye!